So I really want this to be a time, I think we want this to be a time, we might discuss something, with each other that maybe we missed from a slide. We want you, some of you are experts, and if you have a comment or you have a question or you have something that you want to say, please feel free to do that. We want this to be inclusive. We also want you to participate and this to be a good time of discussion. So looking at the statistics, now this is, I don't want you to be alarmed. We probably have not gone from 85 students to 620, so don't panic. But we have, in the last couple of years that I've been here, we've been trying to work on how to track our students who have accommodations, doing a better job with that. And so on our active list through PeopleSoft, we have approximately 620 students that have received accommodations over the last 3 years. We probably on average service about 420 students per year. Now, those are students who have accommodations usually all 4 years. There are more students who have accommodations that are temporary due to concussions or injuries or illness or different things that impact them for maybe a semester. As you can see, we service undergraduate students, graduate students, and UC students. There are students who come in, and one of the things with disability services is that there's an application process. So there's an application, there's documentation that we have to have from a qualified professional before students qualify for having accommodations. And this process sometimes takes anywhere from 2 weeks, sometimes it might take a month. And sometimes the process takes a little bit longer because the documentation is not what we need in order to qualify a student. So we really work hard to make sure that the application is solid and that the students that we approve for accommodations are approved because they have a substantial limitation. That without accommodations they might struggle, more so if they didn't have those accommodations. So the laws that govern disability services, why do we do this? There's several reasons. It's not just the law. It is the right thing to do, in my opinion. I think that there is, the compliance that we can have, then we need to think as a Christian university, what is the right thing to do by way of our students, by way of our faculty, by way of our staff, by way of people who come and participate in our community for various different reasons. And so the ADA, as we're probably all familiar with, has the definition for disability. Physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life functions. So also a person who has a history of a record of such an impairment, a person who is perceived by others as having an impairment. So these are all things that we sit with in my office every day. We're thinking, okay, a student comes in and they say, well, I have a disability, but maybe they don't have the documentation. But they've had accommodations in the past. We really try to help the students navigate the college world, and sometimes it's a little tricky for some students. We look at 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which really is a non-discrimination. So what we look at here is that people with disabilities should have equal access to all programs and services on our campus. And they should have, what equal access means is that someone who has a disability should have the same access as someone without a disability. So, we have different places on our campus that we need to think, how can someone with a disability access this? We're not only looking at physical accessibility, now we're looking also at electronic accessibility. How many of you are familiar with some of the electronic accessibility issues? Okay. So we're looking at ways that somebody who goes on our website, who might be blind or might be deaf, and you're thinking, well, how would a deaf person not access our website? What if there's a video that's not captioned? How do they know what the video is about? You might say, well, they can get somebody to, tell them what it's about. Well, why should they have to do that? If you don't have to do that, why should they have to do that? And so these are things that we, talk about and wrestle with. We have a University Access and Accommodations Committee. How many people are on that committee who are here today? Okay. So just so that you know, the university has this committee, and this committee is dealing with issues of accessibility, issues of access and accommodations. And so APU really does, the administration does care about these issues, and this committee was put together so that we can have a place to collectively talk about where are issues of barriers for our students and how can we address those barriers in a way that maybe we change policies. Maybe we, really look at strategic planning for the future and how we can create more access for our student population. So, the ADAAA, anybody familiar with that? Okay, well, this is an addendum to the ADA. And this is an addendum that has actually, I don't want to say it's altered what we do in disability services, but certainly it does change things. Because people who used to qualify for disabilities was very limited in the past. Now with the new ADAAA, more students are qualifying. So students with medical conditions who may not have qualified before are qualifying now. And so this has really opened up students, to apply for accommodations, and you're going to meet some of these students later who have non-apparent disabilities. They have autoimmune disorders, they have digestive, neurological, or sometimes mental illness. And so these are non-apparent disabilities that these students have, and at another time, in another place, on a college campus, they might not have qualified. But now they're qualifying for accommodations because they have a medical condition, a condition that substantially limits a major life function. One of those functions we look at is how that limits them in the academic setting. So you might say, well, how does this limit them in the academic setting? If you have an anxiety disorder, okay, and you are prone to maybe post-traumatic stress disorder, and tests trigger that. When a test comes, you actually have a panic attack that so debilitates you that you can't function, literally. And I know some of us are saying, well, come on, everybody has test anxiety. No, we're not talking about everybody has test anxiety. We're talking about a whole level of anxiety that can be so impactful on a student that they can't get out of bed. And so what we try to do is to limit the anxiety with the accommodations so that when they take that test in the Learning Enrichment Center with extended time, they have equal access to someone who does not have that disorder. So that's why we do some of the, approve some of the accommodations that we do. People with learning disabilities, sometimes just sending a PowerPoint ahead of time so that they can process the information. Writing down the directions instead of just speaking them, writing them can really help someone. You think, well, why can't they just understand my directions because I'm saying them? Well, because sometimes if someone has an auditory processing issue, you speaking it can be harder for them to process the information. They learn differently. They're just as smart as anybody else. It's not about that. It's about how they process information. Someone with mental illness might need a 3-day extension on assignments. Why? Because we have some students who've been 5150'd several times. And so when they're 5150 is when they're on a 72-hour hold, and they can't do assignments during that time. And so sometimes they need a little bit of extra time to regroup and then get back to their assignments. We have students who have chronic depression, and it's pretty debilitating. And so when they're in an episode of their depression and they're really not able to function, sometimes they need a little bit more time to finish assignments. We really try to work very closely with faculty. A lot of times you are working with a student before we are. The faculty, those of you in the room have been absolutely terrific, and I so appreciate you, the staff that are here, the administrators that are here. I just want to thank you so much because I think we do a good job here at APU of working with our students. People have been very kind and compassionate. So that's just a little bit about how this works and how this works with accommodations. What time is it?
8.
Okay. History of disability is, back in the biblical times, we really, people were excluded. We all know that from the Bible. You know, people with leprosy, people with mental illness, who are thought to be demon-possessed, and so they were excluded from society. They thought that people were in sin. And then people were seen around the 17th century under a medical lens. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then in the 1950s, we started to see, okay, we've been institutionalizing people, and a lot of people were institutionalized who shouldn't have been. Then they were deinstitutionalized. The problem with that is that without support. And with, you know, the civil rights, equal rights movement, that's where the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 came into play, 504, and then ADA. And it's interesting to me to think that ADA was just passed in 1990. I mean, 1990, it's just not that long ago. Anyway, go ahead. And so there's theoretical models of disability, and I'm sorry I'm going to go through these very quickly. We can actually probably send the PowerPoint to you if you're interested. We talked a little about the religious historical. Medical model is something's wrong with you, okay? And go ahead and go to the next slide. So the religious spiritual model of disability says you need to be healed. Okay, and actually, Dr. Guido gave me a great article, a Dear Abby article, and I wanted to read it to you because I think it really highlights this idea. This is a wheelchair user feels encroached on. Dear Abby, I use a wheelchair as a result of a congenital disability. I am in my 30s. Recently, I was sitting outside a cafe drinking a cup of coffee when a man at a nearby table approached me and asked if he could pray for me. I shrugged and said, okay. He then proceeded to grab my hand and ask Jesus to heal me, quote unquote. Then he continued to explain to me at great length all about how I could be healed if I accepted Jesus into my heart. I realized this man meant well, but I can't help finding his behavior a tad presumptuous. I've been disabled since birth, so I don't have any experience of what it is to be otherwise. I've never considered myself to be, quote unquote, sick. Is there any way I can say no to these kinds of approaches without coming across as rude? And then Dear Abby says, Dear Chair Chick, that's how she identified herself. You're an individual and you have the right to feel free within your space. He did ask if he could pray for you. If this happens in the future, say, no thank you. Otherwise, I suggest a gentle interruption. This man placed his hands on you, and so you could place a hand on his, make eye contact and say, excuse me, sir, I understand that you mean well, but I'm not sick or in need of healing. Please don't presume what I need, because obviously I'm perfect just as I am. And so I think that we've come, you know, a long way in terms of how we see people who are different, people who are not like us. You know, the perspective that everybody should be like us, the ableist perspective, is something that we need to vet that out in terms of our own perceptions about who we think we are versus who someone else is and their value. Go ahead. And so go ahead, we'll just move on from this. So go ahead, we'll go to the next. So there's another idea about social construct. So in this construct, the society needs to change. We need to change. We need to adjust. Like I asked if you would please put away food and not chew during the presentation this afternoon because of one student who has a disability that has been very debilitating for her. She has a very strong reaction to people who are eating or chewing. Now you say, okay, I don't understand this. I don't either, but it's documented. You can ask Dr. Fiala.
No, you can't.
No. So this is something that is very challenging for the student. Okay. Now, so we're all going to need to adjust to her for this time, for 30 minutes. For 30 minutes. Okay, this might be another situation where we, you know, create access for someone. Whereas we think, well, we want to take the stairs. Well, not everybody can take the stairs. Okay. We think that, well, people in our classroom shouldn't have, you know, make noises, okay, at all, or have panic attacks or something like that. Well, what can we do? What environment changes can we make to maybe make that a little bit more inclusive environment for them? And I know you guys do that. You faculty are really amazing. You're very on top of these things, and I so appreciate it. So that's just a little bit about the social construct. The social justice is more really focusing on how do we eliminate ableism, which is the idea, it's almost like sexism, or something that how do we eliminate our bias towards people who are able-bodied or not able-bodied. So really social justice says we seek to redefine what is considered normal. Because we all think, okay, well that's not normal. Well, you're right, there's certain things that maybe aren't in the norm, but who are we to define that? Okay, so that's more of the social justice. And then really looking at the responsibility in society. That there's a lot of work that we need to do with our perceptions, with our attitudes, with our behaviors, that can actually help people to feel more, or students to feel more included. Okay. And so this is just the basics between actually the social model and the medical model, which you can see this real quickly, and I'll just let you read it. I won't read it for you. But this kind of makes that distinction. And I think the biggest thing with the medical model is that we look at the pathology of disability, and we look at what's wrong instead of what's right. And, we're a strength-based university. Woo! So, so a lot of times students will come to my office, and I've had students, undergrad to grad, male, female, crying because of their lack of self-efficacy, because they have struggled their entire lives with learning, that they've worked hard, they've challenged themselves, they've gotten into either their bachelor's program or their grad program, doctoral program sometimes, and they're crying because they feel so insecure. And so and they tell me all that's wrong, everything that's wrong, and I say, but you're sitting here, you had to do some things that were right. And there has to be some things that you're doing that have compensated. So I try to focus on what they've done to compensate so that they really focus on that strength, because that's what's going to carry them through. Okay, go ahead. So we want you to talk at your tables just a few minutes, not long, but our view of disability really impacts how we treat people. So any way that we think about a group impacts the way we treat that group. So when you hear the word disability, or someone tells you, I have a disability, what do you think? What do you think about that person? And the really important thing, I think, in this whole diversity discussion, and how disability fits in with this diversity, is that, anytime that we marginalize a group, because they're different, it means we have work to do. I have work to do. I mean, I have lots of work to do in lots of areas. But I think we have to really be honest with ourselves about how do we view people who have ADD. A lot of times, we roll our eyes. Well, everybody has ADD. Everybody has ADHD. Well, some people have it, and it's very significant. I mean, it's very debilitating for them. Okay. Well, is the truth that sometimes maybe some of the medical professions might diagnose someone with something, and we're like, oh, I don't think so. But I'm not qualified, to challenge them. But, there's a lot of our students who are really struggling with these things. So how do our attitudes and perceptions impact that? And then for your discussion at your table, just a few minutes, we want you to talk about, and I know I glazed over this so quickly, we have so much to do in such a short amount of time, is what model or models do you feel promote access and or reduce barriers to inclusion? So we're looking at medical, we're looking at social, we're looking at social justice, okay? Those are the primary ones. So what do you think would help us to promote access and to reduce barriers? So talk about that at your table. So this next part of the presentation, Dr. Holden's going to talk a little bit more in depth about reductions to barriers, and I know this will be a really enriching time. Thank you. And then she's going to also pass it on to Mary real quickly, and then lead us into the panel discussion with our students.
Thank you, Beth. So, I started with this illustration to kind of highlight some common barriers that people with disabilities face. It's a cartoon image of children at the bottom of snow-covered steps and ramp, waiting to enter a school. Student using a wheelchair states, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" The person shoveling states, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp off for you." The student using the wheelchair states, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." So, story of my life. I thought it was a great depiction. Beth did a good job at covering some of the barriers that I was going to highlight, so I won't go into detail about most of them. I want to spend most of our time talking about the attitudinal barriers. These are barriers that often emerge from a lack of understanding or false perceptions and assumptions about people with disabilities. And there are quite a few of them. I was going to try to be a rock star and memorize all of this, but I decided not to.
But she made a great graphic. I mean, seriously, I love this.
I spent most of my time doing this. So as I read through each of these descriptions, I want you to reflect on which of these, if any, influence how you might respond or interact with students with disabilities. So first there's inferiority, which is believing that an individual with a disability is less than or a second-class citizen because the person may be impaired in one of life's major functions. This causes able-bodied people not to recognize that people with disabilities may have skills that compensate for their impairment or help them to proceed with their daily lives with little to no problems. Then we have pity, which is feeling sorry for a person with a disability, which tends to lead to patronizing attitudes. People with disabilities generally don't want pity or charity. They want equal opportunity and to earn their own way in living independently. So then you have hero worship, which is considering it triumphant when a person with a disability does ordinary things like living alone, going to school, holding down a job. When doing these things are the norm for most people. This is important to know because most people with disabilities have just adapted to their adversities and don't want accolades or to be praised or considered brave for simply getting up and going about their day. Then you have ignorance, which is dismissing people with disabilities as incapable of accomplishing a task without the opportunity to display their skills. For example, assuming that people who use wheelchairs can't thrive, or people who are deaf can't enjoy music, and displaying amusement when you discover these truths. Then you have spread effect, which is assuming that an individual's disability negatively affects other senses or personality traits. It impairs the total person. So for example, many people shout when speaking to someone who is blind, or don't expect people who are using wheelchairs to speak intelligently or to be able to speak for themselves. Focusing on the person's ability rather than their disability counters this prejudice. Then you have disempowering and overprotecting, which is assuming that people with disabilities cannot know what is best for themselves, so you make decisions for them to shelter them from failing or getting hurt. This also involves imposing help rather than offering it, and not talking directly to the person when in their presence. Then you have backlash, which is believing that individuals with disabilities are given unfair advantages, such as easier work requirements. It's important to remember that people with disabilities need to be held to the same standards. They don't require special privileges or lower performance standards to do tasks. Denial. When disabilities are hidden or non-apparent, such as learning disabilities, pain, psychiatric disabilities, people tend to believe that these are not bona fide disabilities that need accommodations. And lastly, we have fear, which is being afraid that you will say or do the wrong thing around someone with a disability, therefore avoiding your own discomfort by interacting with these individuals with disabilities from a distance, not engaging in conversation with them or about their disabilities. So, as I was going through this, I could think of personal experiences I've had of being on the receiving end of a lot of these. So I think despite people's efforts or intentions, we tend to ascribe to these attitude types sometimes. So now we will talk about faculty attitudes and perceptions. Do you want to cover this one?
Oh, sure, I'd be happy to. Let's see. Let me grab this mic really quick, and that way we don't need to gestures too much. So I think it's important too that we recognize, and as a staff member I can say this, that this is faculty perceptions, but it's also staff perceptions. It's everyone's perceptions when it comes to, treating people around us with respect and helping them so that their playing field is as even as ours is. So our attitudes are influential to students with disabilities. And what we do, what we say, and what we think can hinder them, or it can encourage them and enhance their attempts to have appropriate accommodations implemented, and it can enhance their ability to maximize their educational potential with ease.
There was a study conducted that highlighted if a student requests accommodation from a professor and their initial request is met by an unfavorable response, they're less likely to address their needs in future courses. So how you respond can really dictate how a student navigates their disability in the future.
Absolutely. And so one of the data points here is that negative attitudes of faculty are cited as a primary reason that students with disabilities can fail at the post-secondary level. It's not the only reason, but it is very important. Those negative attitudes can lead to low expectations about what people with disabilities can contribute to their classroom or society. And it can also lead to questioning the efficacy and the needs for accommodations. Sometimes accommodations are looked at as unfair advantages, entitlements, or an excuse as opposed to a right and an opportunity to level the playing field. In most cases, and I love this point at the bottom, faculty members report being supportive of students with disabilities, and they have favorable attitudes towards such students.
So that's the good news. However, the bad news is that most students with disabilities don't perceive that as true. They perceive that faculty are resistant towards meeting their basic needs academically when it comes to the unique challenges that they face, and they feel that they don't respond favorably. So there's some discrepancy between faculty and staff's intent and how it's received by students with disabilities. So studies indicate that to effectively reduce attitudinal barriers, contact and knowledge must be combined to dispel any misconceptions that one must hold. So to give you all insight into what it's really like to live with a disability and how that can make being a student more challenging, we wanted you to hear firsthand from some APU students who identify as having a disability. So you can learn from their experiences. So thank you all for joining us, and you guys can take a seat. We'll let them get settled.